Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Ben, and this is a monthly reading wrap-up for July of 2024. So, enjoying a day outside. It is one of the few days that we've had this summer that is not excruciatingly humid. And I've got a stack of books here. These are all books that I finished reading in July of 2024. I'm just going to go and very quickly summarize them. All of these books I have spoken about more in depth in previous videos. My Fresh Red Kills videos are my more in-depth reading update videos that go on throughout the month. And all of them have been talked about on those, except for the Star Trek books. I had a Book Trek video for that, and I guess I'll start with that. So this is to say that this is just a very sort of brief summary. It is not, these are not reviews. If you want to know more of my thoughts on any of them, you can go to those previous videos, and it'll be more expansive. And this, I'm also not going to be talking about these in the order that I read them. This is just kind of the order of the stack. So the first one said, I read this for Book Trek 2024. Book Trek is a yearly reading event where myself and some great co-hosts, throughout the summer, we basically just read and talk about Star Trek fiction. And I read this for the month of July. So this is Time for Yesterday by A.C. Crispin. This came out in the, I think, late 80s. It is a sequel to a book that she had written and published in the early 80s. That book was a sequel to the original series episode All Our Yesterdays. And it is really about Spock having a son by a woman 5,000 years ago due to some time travel issues that happened inside that episode. And the first book was basically about Spock going back and retrieving that son. And then here they are, once again, reconnecting. I did enjoy this one. We've got some problems going on with the Guardian of Forever. It's that circular stone that you see Czar, Spock's son, riding through. Basically, this has issues going on with the Guardian of Forever in terms of messing up time in the universe, and they need somebody who can psychically communicate with the Guardian of Forever, and they know that Czar had that ability, so they have to go back in time to retrieve him. And I enjoyed this overall. I like how A.C. Crispin writes the characters. I think it feels like a more character-driven story, and she's a very thoughtful writer, especially when it comes to the characters. Excuse me. I read this very short little piece. This is on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. He's a historian who I really enjoyed his book Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. I thought that was a very, very good history. And I remember when this first came out, this is after Trump was first elected, and he kind of saw dangers, essentially the things that Trump was saying and doing, and he saw dangerous parallels with the rise of fascism especially, and totalitarianism in the early 20th century. So he basically goes through lessons of how we can combat tyranny, and he gives a little bit of, the modern warning and then the historical precedents. And very quick read. Glad I read it. I think if there is an updated version of this, the digitally or audio, where he has like 20 more lessons added to it, but I found this for I think 50 cents or something like that at a used bookstore, so thought I would pick it up, especially with this election cycle. Once again, making it feel like the country's going crazy. It's had me in a little more of a political mood. That'll be reflected in another book that I'll talk about later. I also read Ender's Game, a book that had been sitting on my shelf for probably at least 20 years. This was given to me by a friend a very long time ago. I know that they loved the book, and I finally got around to it. This is one of those books that was on banned books lists. Now, when I say banned books, we're really talking about challenged books. And in the beginning of the year, I had looked at the banned books lists, and I looked at the books on my shelves I hadn't read yet, and this matched up. So there's 9 others that I'm reading throughout the year for that. And this was okay. I know this is a very well-loved science fiction book. It feels very YA to me, which I didn't know going into it. I knew the twist going into this, but I didn't really know a lot about the story itself. I feel like if I read this when I was 13, I'd probably have a much more fond reaction to it. As it is, I think that there are some really interesting ideas going on here. I just wasn't pulled in by the story. I wasn't really pulled in by the Ender character. There's a subplot involving Ender siblings and them kind of blogging their way to power that just didn't really reflect true to me. So yeah, I had a much harder time kind of just getting into the story. It was not really a page turner for me. So I'm glad I read it. Like I said, interesting ideas. I understand, I think at least to a point, why sci-fi fans love this so much. It just wasn't necessarily something that connected with me. Another sort of sci-fi book that I read in July was this, John Scalzi's Redshirts. I read this also as a part of Book Trek 2024. Reading Star Trek fiction is the main mission, but we have 2 optional away missions. One of them is reading nonfiction science. The other one is basically reading things having to do with Star Trek. Not necessarily Star Trek fiction, but a kind of book that wouldn't exist without Star Trek. So that could be things like this. The Redshirts is an obvious take on the old, in the original series, if an away party went on a planet, and you had Kirk and Spock, McCoy, and then there was just some random red shirt guy down there, he probably was not going to make it back. So it's a take on that. So this book would not exist without Star Trek. So I had read this. This has been on my shelf, honestly, for a few years. And I read this as a buddy read with Dave over at the Book Blather. He's a really nice guy. Please, if you don't know his channel, check it out. He's a really good guy. And we had a very similar reaction to this, I think. We both like the idea. This gets very meta. It starts off as almost like a little bit more Star Trek parody, but it makes a lot of left turns. And I liked a lot of the left turns. It gets meta upon meta upon meta. And this is kind of another situation where I like the ideas. I wasn't crazy about the execution in a lot of this. The writing itself left a lot to be desired for me. And the ending felt a little bit dragged out and overindulgent. This is another one, I'm kind of glad that I read it. It's a funny novel, but I didn't really laugh. It tries a little bit too hard to be funny at times, and I'm not a humorless person, believe it or not. So yeah, I'm kind of middling on this. I'm somewhere in the middle. And I said, I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I read it with Dave. And yeah, again, if you want to hear my deeper thoughts, you can go to that video. Okay. So, read this as well as a quick read. Paganism for Beginners, The Complete Guide to Nature-Based Spirituality for Every New Seeker by Althaea Sebastiani. This, I have kind of gotten more of an interest in paganism, not entirely as a practitioner. I have been working to incorporate certain sort of, I would say, paganistic rituals into my life. I am not, I'm an atheist, but I am interested in earth-based rituals, the sorts of rituals and having celebrations throughout the year to be more connected to nature, to use a mythopoetic, to give a veneer of enchantment to the world. I'll kind of get to the next book that I'm I'm going to present. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about the overall pagan community. I certainly watched a lot of YouTube videos, but they all kind of have different takes on it. So I thought if I got a popular introduction text, and this one is actually very well reviewed of the people who read it, I thought this would give me a pretty good consensus over what people consider to be pagan. And I guess it kind of does its job. It certainly introduces a lot of things, the basics of paganism. And I think that if somebody is a polytheist who is thinking about becoming a pagan, this would definitely be a great book for them. My biggest gripe, and it goes back to that polytheist thing that I just said, is that this leaves out a lot of other types of paganism because it is very strictly polytheistic. It leaves out things like humanistic paganism, secular paganism, atheopaganism. Religious naturalism, I don't think really fit. She does briefly discuss pantheism, but it seems to be more of like just one of her exceptions, the only one, really. And I had issues with this not really being very well sourced. There was some information in here that I really wish I could have looked up. Didn't sit right. So, yeah, just to be clear, I am a naturally skeptical person, and I am very much naturally also secular. So me trying to bring in aspects of ritual and celebration into my life is something that's very conscious. It's not something that comes naturally to me. So I approach these things from a sort of aloof academic stance. So when I comment on things like this, just kind of have that in mind. I am not a believer, and I am not entirely the target audience, but nevertheless, I'm interested in the subject. This sort of relates to it. There's another one I was glad to find at a secondhand store. Reenchanted World, The Quest for a New Kinship with Nature by James William Gibson. This was published, I think, in around 2009, so just after the Bush administration, which reflects very heavily in the second half of this book. So what we have here is a book looking at, it's kind of like a survey of American history through the eyes of people who found a kinship with nature, who started to see the natural world not as a place to extract resources from, but as a place that we could consider sacred, that we can have a deeper connection to. Things like trees, or looking into the eyes of an animal and recognizing a personhood for the first time. People having very transformative experiences with nature, and then therefore changing the way that they interact with it. So that's kind of the first third of the book. Then in the middle second half of the book, he gets more into the ways that that sort of thing is being challenged. And that's, by the way, that mystical kinship is what he calls the enchantment of the world. So then he talks about the things that go against the enchantment of the world, the enchantment of nature. And a lot of that really was kind of evangelical Christian, right-wing conservative, political movements, especially. He has kind of a long list of different things that the administration of George W. Bush was doing to destroy enchantment and also bring down a lot of the environmental protections that had existed up until that point. And then he does end up talking about things looking up again towards the end. But really glad I read it. Like I said, the second half of this book feels very much of its time, but the first half I really appreciated, and I liked reading about all these different Americans who started having these sort of transformative experiences, because that's the sort of thing, I won't say that I've had a transformative experience, but the way that people interact with nature is something that I'm deeply interested in, and it is one of my main interests also in this aspect, by adding sort of ritual and mythopoetic into the mix. So these are kind of two sides of, or two elements, two paths to something that I'm interested in. All right, two more, really quickly. I also read Mary L. Trump's Too Much Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. This is a sort of family memoir from Donald Trump's niece, who is trained in clinical psychology, and she talks about her family, especially her grandfather, Donald Trump's father, and her father, Donald Trump's brother, and how her family really kind of destroyed her father, it seems like, in a lot of ways. He died way too young. And how they propped up Donald Trump, especially how her grandfather did, and really helped to kind of create this individual that we are still dealing with these days. So, you know, it was insightful to see her perception, her memories of her family, how she interpreted the things that her family did, and especially the things that her uncle did, Donald Trump. And she does, as a clinical psychologist, sort of try to diagnose these people. But overall, it was a quick read. It confirmed a lot of things that I already suspected. And, you know, again, I'm just kind of in that political mindset because of this election cycle right now. And finally, I read this very thin volume. I think I read this in like an hour. Voices from Colonial America, Connecticut, 1614 to 1776 by Michael Burgan, part of a National Geographic series, and this goes into just basically a quick survey of American history, Connecticut colonial history to be specific, and it does a pretty good job. I mean, this is written for a younger crowd, probably like middle school age is the most appropriate. It even has like just as an example here. The kinds of things that you'd see in like a younger person's textbook. Of course, I'm not going to see it. I'm looking for it. Anyway, oh yeah, things like vocab in the margins. But you also get pretty cool scenes of primary sources, and it does a pretty good job of showing the different dimensions of life in a very short amount of time. And it's definitely a good springboard for further research. And yeah, it's definitely going to come in handy in some things that I'll be doing over the next few years. I'll probably be dipping into this for reference. But yeah, so those are the books that I read in July of 2024. Just making my stack here. As I always say, if you've read any of these, love to hear your thoughts. We've got Colonial Connecticut, A Reenchanted World, Too Much and Never Enough, Paganism for Beginners, Redshirts, on Tyranny, Ender's Game, and Time for Yesterday. As always, thank you, BookTube.